Hello, I'm Grandmaster Alejandro Ramirez here to bring you the action of Game 8. We certainly were waiting to see what Magnus Carlsen's approach to his first white after winning Game 6 would be. Of course, match strategy would say that playing solidly would be perfectly acceptable, forcing Ian Nepomniachtchi to take risks either with the black pieces, which would be unusual, or with the white pieces, and then we would have a full rest day to prepare for that game. Let's see how the game transpired, and if that was the case, by jumping into the action. Analyzing the match situation with Grandmaster Alex Kolovich, we thought that the move e4 would be extremely likely from Magnus Carlsen today. First of all, we thought that the English opening would be a difficult one to force a solid position, as black has so many options to play actively against it. And the move d4 in some Catalan variations has proven to be dynamic in this match so far. On the other hand, e4 has been met by Nepomniachtchi with the move e5 and a Petrov defense that usually presents very little risk for the white pieces, and in many variations allows white a very tiny advantage. So if Magnus Carlsen brought an idea, it would probably be there. An extremely solid one, but why not? He's up a full game over his opponent. And it wasn't a surprise for myself when we saw exactly that appear on the board. A quick deviation, the move d4 instead of knight takes e5, still one of the main lines of the Petrov. And after knight takes e4, bishop d3, d5, knight takes e5, knight d7, knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, we reach a position that is extremely common in the Petrov, and almost automatically, white almost always castles in this position, with the idea of playing a very quick c4 and then challenging the pawn on d5, or by playing a very quick knight c3, which has become a lot more popular recently, with the idea of forcing black to take on c3 and play out certain structures, such as like this, to give an example, in which white gets an open file, they get a queen to f3 or h5 in some cases, and they can pressure their opponent. And actually, Magnus Carlsen's opponent, Ian Nepomniachtchi, used this successfully against Yu Yangyi in the World Team Championship of 2019. A famous game because the Russian player in that one finished the game with a victory and actually finished the game with more time than he started, which is a very rare feat at Grandmaster chess. But instead, Magnus, yet again in this match, finds a very uncommon move with the knight early in the opening, the move knight d2, which to our eyes did not seem to be the most thematic or the most dangerous way of playing this position. Black doesn't have a lot of choices here. You kind of have to take on d2. You don't want to retreat the knight on f6, even though perhaps it's not the end of the world, but it would certainly give white a little bit of an edge. Knight takes d2 seems much more logical, bishop takes d2, and here we were actually baffled by Jan's choice. We thought the move queen e7 would be the most natural, but perhaps Jan smelled a fish somewhere around here, some kind of trap, it's kind of hard to say. Because after the move, for example, bishop e3, queen b4 check, you attack the pawn and you attack the king. And even though white could sacrifice this pawn with a move like queen d2 and then try to short castle, I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be enough compensation. And if it is, if it's more than enough for just equality. And in the case that you don't play the move bishop e3, you're really relegated to playing the move queen e2. And in this kind of positions that are completely symmetrical, as you can see, the structures on the king side and the queen side are exactly the same. It's only really dangerous for black if white keeps the queens alive. Without the queens, it's very difficult for white to really make any progress. Usually these games end in an easy draw. And of course, as I had mentioned earlier, match strategy might dictate that a draw is completely fine for Magnus in this position. That being said, bishop d6 was played after a small thing by the Russian player, and after castles, I think Jan realized that his position was no longer as easy as he hoped. If he simply mimics what white has done and plays the move castle, he has to reckon with the move queen h5. And in this case, the white queen attacks h7 and attacks d5. A double attack which is awkward to defend against. The only way to deal with it is with the move f5, but this is pretty awkward for black. You're giving up control over e5 in the long term, and this could be emphasized by playing a move like queen f3 and challenging this dark squared bishop with bishop f4, trying to get a rook to e5 later in the game. It could also be possible to play the move bishop g5, ask where the queen's going to go, and only then play the move queen f3. In either case, it seems that black is very far from fully equalizing. There are some crazy lines, as for example, queen h4 first, taking initiative in the position, but in many variations that include queen e2 check, forcing the king to go somewhere, and then white playing f4, we have a complete reversal of situations. Since black isn't able to comfortably meet the move queen e2 check, he has to give up either the right of castling or pin his own bishop on e6. The situation changes, and actually white is the one with a big initiative. I don't think this was Jan's plan at all, and after a significant thing, he came up with the move h5, a very surprising move. I was analyzing this with a few grandmasters. We didn't even consider the move h5, but it's an interesting one. It solves the problem of this queen coming to h5 herself, and it grabs some space on the king side. And of course, the question is rook e1 check a good move in this position, simply hitting the king? However, after analyzing this with some subtlety and with some engines, we came to the conclusion that actually rook e1 check is not a good move. That the king on f8 is going to be perfectly well placed, that because this pawn is on h5 already, black didn't want to castle kingside anyway, and that the rook on e1 might not be perfectly placed, because in many variations when the queen comes to h4 and that's this fork, you wouldn't have the ability to play f4, defending d4 and defending h2. Magnus actually thought forever in this position, a huge 40-minute think to try to figure out how to punish black's setup. He said he was unable to find anything concrete or anything that actually gave him a promising advantage. In my analysis, I thought c4 was the way to go. The idea is that if black takes on c4, now the move rook e1 comes with a little bit more sense, because in many variations after king f8, bishop takes c4, you will have the ability to play queen f3, hitting this pawn and hitting this pawn, and that might be much more awkward for black to deal with. There are also many scenarios in which, of course, black can counterattack with queen h4, but because of the weakness of that king on f8, I don't believe in black's equalizing chances. Of course, it is also possible to take on c4 immediately and keep the idea of rook e1 later, and that might be even more precise than rook e1 first. Instead, Magnus tried what I think is a strange idea, queen e1 check. Now, there are two ways of meeting this check with some logic. You don't want to pin yourself, and you don't want to retreat the bishop. But out of the two remaining ones, king f8 and queen e7 is certainly the more logical one. As I had explained earlier, in the positions in which you trade off the queens, it doesn't really matter if white gets a few tempi in. It's very unlikely that without queens, white is going to be able to put enough pressure on black's structure in this kind of symmetrical positions. And actually, after the game, Magnus himself thought that after queen e7, black would have no real issues. Instead, king f8 was played, and this allowed bishop b4, which does not give a great advantage, but at least takes off the dark squared bishop that black is using to harass on this diagonal to defend the position on on e5, that allows this rook to come into the center with certain initiative. So it was a little bit of a baffling situation, but still not the end of the world. I think the real mistake came in this position. There are, of course, many ways for black to try to solve his problems. He would like to coordinate these two rooks, and he does it in a creative but perhaps not ideal way. I don't see anything particularly wrong with either taking on e1 first or playing the move g6, with the idea of king g7 and then connecting the rooks. Of course, in some scenarios you'll be worried of leaving some dark square weaknesses around your king, and it is counterintuitive strategically to leave all of your pawns on light squares when you have a light squared bishop. But in this position, the most important thing is to get your rooks active and coordinated, and Jan wasn't able to do that at any point. Rook h6 was his choice, but I think queen g5 was a pretty decent alternative. As long as the queen is attacking this pawn on h5, it's difficult for Jan to coordinate his rooks. He cannot play the move rook h e6 because the pawn on h5 will always be hanging, and this means that the position on the king side will be fractured, at least for a few moves. c6 was played, rook takes e8 check, bishop takes e8, rook e1, taking control over the only open file, and even though perhaps this isn't that bad for black, it obviously feels unpleasant. It feels like black is very far from fully equalizing. He has the worst bishop, his king's a little bit weaker than white's, this queen and this rook don't make an amazing coordination effort, and the dark squares are weak. Of course, this position is still very solid, and it is difficult for white to concretely attack anything, at least something that is difficult for black to defend. But you would definitely prefer to be white in this position. Queen f6, queen e3 was played. Of course, you want to retain as much material as possible. Bishop d7, a clever move h3, giving the king some loft, and also preventing the move bishop g4 in certain scenarios. h4 was played, which is a decent move. It does move the pawn out of the light squares. And c4, which I think is probably the most problematic way to deal with black's position. And here I think d takes c4, bishop takes c4 already forces black to find something concrete. There are certain problems in the position. Queen a3 check is of course the main problem. You're simply picking up the pawn on a7 because the queen will be defending this pawn on d4. And most commentary teams thought that the move king g8 was the best way to equalize. It is important to notice that after king g8, d5, a very nice break. You don't take immediately on d5, because after bishop takes d5, white's pieces are certainly superior to black's, and there will be problems on the queen side, considering that black has the setup of the rook on h6 and the queen on f6. So white would still be preferred here in this position. But b6 actually, surprisingly, shuts down white's activity. There's still some calculation to be done, such as queen e7, c takes, bishop takes, and the important move bishop c6. But engines say black's completely fine and actually start leaning towards triple zeros, despite everything that's happened before. But here, to everybody in Dubai, everybody that's watching this game, that's commentating on it, Ian played a move that nobody considered, and it's a huge blunder. The move b5 is simply a huge tactical oversight. And after Magnus played the refutation, queen a3 check, Ian didn't come back to the board for a few minutes. It was clear that he had either missed this move, which is very surprising because it was the original threat that white had, queen a3, queen takes a7, or something went wrong on his further calculation. But I don't really understand what it could have been. There are only two lines in this position. If you play queen d6, I still take your pawn on a7. The bishop on c4 is taboo, because after queen a8 check, you simply get back rank mated. There's no way to defend properly against mate on the 8th rank. And what happened in the game, king g8 still gets met with queen takes a7, simply because the bishop on d7 is hanging. And after something like bishop takes h3, at the very least, you have the move bishop takes f7 check, winning a pawn, but there are more ways to win a pawn, and there are even better ways to win a pawn, and it really doesn't matter which one you choose. The fact is, white's up a pawn, so why would you go for this variation? Really baffling, but it's perhaps nerves that got to the Russian superstar. After queen d8, bishop b3, rook d6, the precise move rook e4 was played, and black's position is simply collapsing. Not only is he down a pawn, but these are weaknesses. This pressure is super annoying. Rook f4 is coming, h4 is weak, queen c5 is also coming. Black has no real coordination, and after bishop e6, which is an incredibly sad move to play, bishop takes, rook takes, pawn takes. This queen endgame at this level of chess is a basic win. White's up a pawn, has the better structure, and has very simple winning plans. Queen c5 is important. It attacks this pawn on c6, forcing black into some kind of passive mode. And if he plays something passive like queen c7, first of all, I can start harassing these pawns, but honestly, the clean, simple, and obvious b3, a4, push the pawns to the end as a simple winning plan, and there's nothing that black can really do about it. Once the pawn reaches a6, that will be game over. No real way to stop it. Ian tried the move queen a5, but it doesn't work tactically. Queen takes c6, queen e1 check, king h2, queen takes f2, queen takes e6 check, king h7, and now white is up 2 full pawns on a queen endgame. The only hope that black has in this position is to give some sort of perpetual with queen g3, queen f4, and then another check on the first rank. But at this level of chess, it's never going to happen. And of course, Magnus, not even close to letting that happen. Queen e4 check, king g8, b3, queen takes on a2. No point on giving this check because simply king g1, and the king hides rather easily. Queen e8 check, king h7, queen takes b5, and as we say sometimes in chess, at this point, everything wins. Black has no real counterplay, the 2 pawns are passed and ready to roll, and the queen has many ways of preventing the opponent's perpetual. Queen f2, queen e5, maybe not the most precise, but at this point, as I said, everything wins. Queen b2, and putting the queen behind the passed pawn, like if it was a rook, allowing this pawn to simply march forward, is one of the many ways of winning. And we're just going to go through the motions. Both players really just going through the motions at this point. Now the queen on d1 controls the first rank. This pawn is ready to roll. When the queen blocks it, the other pawn is going to be ready to roll. I'm going to combine that with threats on h4. For Magnus Carlsen, the endgame genius, perhaps the greatest endgame genius of all time, this is really easy. g5, d5, g4, trying to create some kind of threat. But after h takes g4, h3, queen f3, Nepo simply threw in the towel. The only idea that he has is to take on g2, but after king takes g2, queen d2 check, king really anywhere, white will simply be able to hide from the checks however he feels like it. King h3, for example, queen h6, king g3, queen d6, king g2, among others, simply prevents black from coordinating any kind of checks. White has way too many pawns for black to set up any kind of perpetual. This was a very strange game. It seemed like in many cases, Carlsen himself was unable to find a real advantage. And even after a 40-minute think, allowing the move queen e7 was a clear indication that Magnus was okay in playing a very, very drawish endgame and just trying to press almost out of nothing. But somehow Nepo either misevaluated that position or tried to keep chances alive, and it's really hard to say which one it was. But it's clear that psychologically something must have happened. As Carlsen himself said, he wouldn't have won this game if he had not won game 6. It feels like Nepo has not really recovered fully from that loss, and that certainly must have affected him in today's game. A player of Nepo's caliber in a tournament or match as important as the World Championship should never play a move like b5. And to be honest, it's going to take a titanic amount of psychological power for the challenger to come back in this match. And if he achieves it and wins twice and then wins on the tiebreak, or even wins 3 games before the tiebreaks are reached, I would dub this as the greatest comeback in chess history.